we want humility, and I think that sometimes we don't ask God for the things that we just don't. James says, that sometimes our prayers are not answered because we ask amiss. But if we're asking for something that's going to make our life easier, make our life better, I just can't see how that could be a problem. But I found myself not wanting to pray for things that I necessarily want, or things that mean a lot to me, because I don't want to feel selfish. I remember an old baseball movie years ago. I can't remember you remember the first Robin Hood? Costner, is that his name? Costner. Kevin Costner. Do you remember that, where he's out, he lives his whole life right out there on the baseball mound? Do you remember that movie? He's starting to hurt. No, I don't believe that's it. No, it's not the one where he builds a baseball field. This is one where he's actually pitching a game. Do I? Pitches a perfect game. He's like 140 years old or something? Okay. Well, in the last inning, and I have found myself doing this over and over, it's the last inning or the next to last inning, he stops for a minute, and he's out there on the mound, and you're hearing his thoughts, and he says, Lord, he says, I've never really asked you, I've never really prayed to you about a baseball game. He said, I always felt like, you probably had other things going on, more important things than how my baseball pitching is going. But he says, I'm not asking you to, make me any better or anything of this nature. But he said, if you could just make this pain in my shoulder just go down a little bit, so that I can do this, just give me the. And so I think sometimes when we think about our prayer life, we're afraid to ask for something when we think it might be deemed as selfish, But we're going to see a fellow tonight. He didn't think that way at all. And, of course, we're going to be talking about the prayer of Jabez. And, of course, this is in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Now, as you do your daily Bible reading from year to year, well, let's just say, Genesis is pretty good. Exodus, you're doing all right. You get to Leviticus, man, it gets rough. Deuteronomy, okay. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers is rough. Deuteronomy more about like a long-running sermon, so you're okay there. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, those are pretty good. But when you get into the Chronicles, and you just hit chapter after chapter of genealogy, sometimes I have to break out Alexander Scorby on that to help me through that. Just listen to him read it as I try to read it, because it can get tough. But tucked right in there in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. It's this prayer of Jabez. Out of nowhere. It just comes. Of course, he's one of the children of Eli. And the first thing we want to talk about is what his name means. The prayer of Jabez. Jabez's name actually means sorrow. Notice, and Jabez was more honorable than his brethren, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bear him in sorrow. I remember the first time that I can recall hearing the name Jabez. We were in Maine in 2001. And we went and visited a church there, and there's only like 5. Kid you not. There's like 5 congregations in the state of Maine. That's rough. But we went to one of the larger ones, which was not too far a piece. I think it was in Oxford. Was that right, Stephanie? Oxford. And not too far from where my in-laws were living. And the preacher who was teaching class, or one of the elders, he asked had any of us read the book, The Prayer of Jabez. And I was like, I'd never even heard it. But even though I'd read this, but you know how you just don't pick up on stuff. And so that's what kind of spurred my interest in this. Notice it says Jabez was more honorable than his brethren, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bear him with sorrow. And the other, let's real quick here, let me look at something. I did not do this to see if the other translations clean that up a little bit. Yeah. The New American Standard Bible, and Corey, if you don't mind, just kind of read along with me there in that ESV. The New American kind of cleans that up a little bit and says, the mother named him Jabez, saying, because I bore him with pain. In other words, it was a traumatic experience, just like God said it would be in Genesis chapter 3. Was that pretty close to what the ESV had as well? In pain. So that's what his name is, and that can be a pretty tough thing. Your name means pain. Like we were studying this past Wednesday night, Isaac, Yitzchak, is actually a name for laughing. And so, parents oftentimes would name their children of what they'd like for them to be or some characteristics they thought that they might have. And so his name entails sorrow. Now, sometimes a name can be a tough thing to go with. Jim, you were pretty talkative this morning. Let me see if I can get you back in that mood. What's the most interesting male name that you've ever run across? Jim, that's one of the reasons I love you expand your horizons, man. You're always looking, Uh-huh. I believe all our mothers. I believe all our mothers said that. I've had to hear that I haven't heard it the last couple of years, but my mother, on June 6th, she'd always call me. And she'd always say, do you know what I was doing? And then put the number of years associated with it, She said, you're lucky you made it, because if I'd known how bad it was going to be, I don't think I'd have done that. But, oh, I don't think so. I don't know. No, but the most interesting name, I remember being at band camp, and was with a bunch of drummers, and there was a guy teaching us. And Brother Francis, don't take issue with this, but we got to talking, and I said, what does the F stand for? And he said, well, that's my name. I said, well, what's the F for? He says, Francis. Well, I was just 15. I just started laughing, and I tell you what, he didn't like that at all. And I was like, really? Your name's Francis? Because I had never heard a man. Of course, that goes to show you how, broad my horizon was. I come to find out there were lots of kings and things named Francis, but I had never heard that name before. Kind of remind me of the Johnny Cash song. You know the one I'm thinking of, right? A Boy Named Sue. Yeah. Do you remember the town where Johnny actually gets to meet up with his dad and they have the fight out in the street? That's in Gatlinburg, wasn't it? Yeah. But anyway, names can be tough, and sometimes they're hard to outlive. And so I think that's the idea here. We see that's the name in Hebrew. It's atzeb, it means sorrow, and it actually just means pain. And one time, it's only used 3 times in Scripture. One time it's used to talk about an idol. Well, we see that same word in Isaiah 14 at verse 3. The Bible says, and it shall come to pass in that day the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow, from your pain, from thy fear, and from thy hard bondage. Notice next his life. He was more honorable. Now this idea of this honorable here, all one word in the Hebrew, and I just I want to throw it up here just so you can get an idea. That's the many different ways this word is translated. Well, you can't even see that, can you? Man, I tried to change the color on that and I couldn't get it to do it. Let me just read them to you. 34 times it's translated honor, 14 times it's translated glorify, honorable 14 times, heavy 13 times, hardened 7 times, glorious 5 times, sore 3 times. So what's the point? It's all over the place. So what exactly does it mean by honorable here? I think it's the way that we normally use that word, that he was doing good. He did good things, because we're going to see that God pays attention to his prayer. Now, the reason I printed this out, I wanted you to be able to at least think about this prayer and think of some of the aspects of this prayer, because it usually, for me, it kind of goes a little bit against the grain of how I normally, one of the things I always try to do when I pray is, I address the Father, but I always want to start my prayer out, because I don't want to forget, I want to thank God. I want to thank God for first of all, the ability, to be able to pray, for the mental faculty to be able to pray. My experience, as I grow older and I've seen things, I've been around a lot of folks who've grown old, and things change in our lives. And, sometimes we take the simplest things for granted, And the things that mean so much when people are in a situation where they can't do it anymore are the simplest. To be able to pray, to be able to have the mental faculty to try to remember what's going on, where you are. I just think it's so interesting when you're in a place where the doctor's trying to talk to one of your loved ones, or remember the church, or whoever you happen to be with, and what's one of the first questions they ask to the patient? What is it? What's your name? What's your name? Well, my name's Ronnie. You might say, no, it ain't Ron. See, it's already working on you too. No, I can remember that. Don't take that for granted. The fact that you can remember who you are. Then they want to know, where are you? Do you know where you are? In other words, are you cognizant of the fact that you're, at a particular place? Do you know why you're here? And so they ask those questions that, the first time that my wife was describing one of my mother-in-law's neurology appointments, I was like, this is the craziest thing I ever heard. Because they were asking things just like, well, as the disease develops and as we get older and stuff, you start to see why they ask such questions, because it really talks about your state of mind. So the simplest thing, thank God that I am able to get up, that I am another word that comes to mind now, ambulatory. What does that mean, Stephanie? Ambulatory. You can what? That you can walk, that you can get around. There's a lot of people can't do that. It was a big deal for my mother, just to be able to get up and sit up in a chair for a few hours. It's something she hadn't done in a while. And you just, you take that for granted. And then you see folks that are struggling with that and that can't do it, that are losing the balance, that are having trouble walking and things of that nature. And all of a sudden it really, thank you, Lord, that I am able to even utter these words to you. Thank you for the air that I breathe, the land on which I live and walk. Just so much to be thankful for. So that's how I do it. But a lot of times I don't pray for what I want a lot of times, unless it's somebody that's sick. I want them to get better, things of that nature. But notice the nature of what Jabez says here. It says, called on the God of Israel. That's going to be number one. That's a big deal. Saying, on that thou wouldest bless me indeed. What's he saying? Bless me. I want you to bless me and enlarge my coast, regions, area. And that thine hand might be with me, and that thou wouldest keep me from evil, that it may not grieve me. And notice the kicker there. What is that? Bless me, make my coast larger, your hand be with me, keep me from evil, that it won't give me a hard time. And evil there is not talking about the devil running around, standing on one of your shoulders, telling you to, hey, go eat, do that, or don't do that. Evil there is just bad. Help me not go through those bad things, that it not grieve me. And notice, those seem pretty personal, aren't they? This is God, this is what I want you to do for me. He's an honorable man. He's somebody that God has respect for, and we know that God has respect for him because it says, and God granted him that which he requested. So let's kind of go down through this prayer for just a moment and appreciate some of the things that he does. First of all, he calls on the right source. He calls on the God of Israel. And, of course, the word God there, the word Israel, Israel's name, the word Israel means God prevails. It comes, when we first run into it, is in Genesis 32:28. You remember Jacob has been wrestling with an angel all night. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. Now, what did Jacob mean? What's that? Heel grabber, supplanter. Yeah, one that's going to, but God says no longer. It's going to be Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. The word literally means, if you look it up, do a little word study, push the button on your phone there or whatever, you're going to see Israel, and it's equal to God prevails. And so he's praying to the right, the right person. God prevails. And this next word, oh that. There are 2 pages in the Hebrew Gesenius is the Hebrew lexicon. And if you were to look up this word, there are literally 2 pages filled with just this word. It is a word that can have so many meanings. I'd like to read some of the things that I have down here for it. First of all, what we would call ancient, the Far East people, and I'm not being racist or anything of that nature, but they are motivated differently than are you and I. Their minds don't think quite like you and I. They are much more susceptible to speeches. They are moved to great emotion through words. And I'm not saying that we haven't ever done that or that we're not getting more like that. I'll tell you one group, though, that, one of the things that when you think about people who stay calm, even the most difficult situations, what nationality hops up in your mind if we want to be, great nations? Anything? Nobody's just me. Think about stuff like that, probably so. But it always seems to me that the British, they just seem to have this, they'll be taking tea, in the middle of artillery fire. I mean, they just seem to be so calm. Whereas Arab folks, they can get worked up. You ever see funerals? They take it pretty rough. And so they're moved by speech more than we are. And then in Genesis 43, if you look at Genesis 43, verse 9 with me, if you will. Genesis 43, and this is verse 9. I guess I better change translations, or that might not. Now this is Judah speaking. He says, I will be surety for him. Of my hand shalt thou require him. If I bring him not unto thee, and set him before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. The word if there's the same word. Please, let this be. Let this be the case. And so I just wish there was some way that, first of all, that I had better skills in Hebrew than I do, but to somehow try to explain just how much of a sway that would be. Oh, that it's a petition, it's a beg, it's if it be the case, if this can take place, then that. He says, notice the next, that thou wouldest bless me indeed. Jabez wants a blessing. Let me ask you something. Would you like to be blessed? That's a silly question, isn't it? Curses or blessings? Which one are you going to choose? Amazing when that's put out before us. It was put out before Israel, and what did they end up choosing ultimately? The cursing. Life and death. What did they choose? Death. They didn't follow God. They knew what he wanted to do. But we want blessings. What does blessing mean? Well, Webster says a thing conducive to happiness or welfare. We want to be happy. We want things happen in our lives that are good. And so, brethren, when's the last time that you asked God, Lord, bless me? Not bless this food or, bless the situation that we're in. But I mean, God, would you bless me? You see, that's just not a prayer that runs across my lips a lot. Because, that hang-up that I have of, wanting to be humble, not trying to, but what is happening here? Do you think that Jabez is a humble man? I believe he is, or God wouldn't answer his prayer. But what is he saying? He is saying the thing that's on the back of all of our minds, isn't he? Bless me. Lord, bless me. The psalmist, you will see how he's thankful so much of the time. He's saying, God, thank you for what you've done for me. But at the same time, deliver me from my enemies. Bless me. And brethren, that needs to be language that we can use. Language that we should use. As a congregation, don't we want to be blessed? Don't we want God to show us and help us to do better things, to be better this year than we were last year? Of course we do. That thou wouldest bless me indeed. And the idea of indeed there is like a whole bunch of, exclamation points, if you will. I'm afraid that I have thought too often that to ask something like that's a sign of immaturity, that it's self-centered, or maybe a sign of spiritual weakness, but I don't believe that's the case at all. In Acts chapter 20 at verse 35, one of the few, if you have the red letter edition, one of the few places, you're boogieing through Acts there, and all of a sudden, poof, there's the red letters, and you're like, wow. What's that doing there? Well, what is that? What does the red letters indicate in those who have a red letter edition? That's Jesus talking, isn't it? Well, this is Paul. He's quoting Jesus, and he says, I have showed you all things that so laboring you ought to support the weak and to remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, what? Read it with me. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, Joe, if I don't have anything, I give you anything? I can't do it. Josephine, by the way. That's Josephine. It's so funny. We were a few weeks ago at Greens Lake Road. I was taking roll, and I was like, the name is the biggest one on the list, and it's Josephine Stewart. And I'm like, Josephine. So I call her name, and of course it's Joe, but I had never, put that together that her name was Josephine. Well, anyway, I was pretty embarrassed. But if we can't give, if we're not prospered, bless me indeed. It's better to give than to receive, but unless we have something to give, we're not going to be able to bless others. So Jesus says better to give than to receive. Why not be blessed and bless others? Luke 18, if you would. Turn there with me, if you would. Luke 18. You're familiar with this passage because of the prayers and so forth that are brought out in it. This is what we call the parable of the unjust judge. He spake a parable unto them that men always ought to pray. And this is what they ought to say. There was a city, a judge who feared not God, neither regarded man, verse 2. And there was a widow in that city. And she came unto him, saying, Avenge me of mine adversary. Well, she has nothing to bribe him with. She has no power of authority. As a matter of fact, she's a woman, which was not as great as being a man in that day and time as far as getting your way or using your authority. She's a widow, so she doesn't have the double income or money to throw around. And so she is like at the bottom of the totem pole as far as legal rights and things go. But she says, avenge me of mine adversary. And he would not for a while. It didn't serve his purpose. Telling who her enemy was. Might have been a friend of his or a campaign contributor or whatever, was going on at that time. But afterward, he said within himself, though I fear not God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. I always love that verse, she weary me, because it's the same verbiage that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 when he says, I keep myself under, and literally beat myself black and blue. I control myself. I beat myself down, if you will, to control myself. That's what he's saying here. She's going to give me a black eye. She's bugging me to death. So unless she weary me, and the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry unto him day and night, though he bear long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedy. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? The idea there is blessed. What did she want? She wanted this judge to bless her. And Jesus is using an illustration. She kept at him until he blessed her. What does that say about our prayer life? That's the point here. Our prayer life, Jesus is saying, learn something from this woman when it comes to prayer. What's he telling us? You keep after it. You keep after it. And when you want God to bless you, you ask God to bless you. Now listen, I don't want for a minute to sound like a TBN network thing. In fact, the guy who wrote the book, that I bought and read it, he said this prayer, I think every day for 30 years or something, and God's, blessed him all this, and that we ought to, if you'll just pray this prayer every day, that your life will be blessed and you'll have this and that and the other. And I'm not saying that for a moment. But what I am saying is that I think as members of the church, a lot of times we're afraid to ask God to give us a hand. And we're afraid to ask God to bless us and help us in our work environment so that we can, provide for our families better than we're doing now, because with disposable income means that we'll be able to bless other folks. It means that we'll be able to, do more things than we are doing now. Corey's fixing to go on a campaign, a long ways off. That takes money. Jets don't run on air. Well, actually, they fly on air. But it takes money. It takes gasoline to fire those things. You got to have pilots. It takes money to get to a place. It takes money to do things there. And as a result, I think that we sometimes think it's selfish or that it's self-willed and maybe even a sign of spiritual weakness to ask for something. It's not. Look at what Jabez is asking for here and see. Enlarge my coast. What's he talking about? Literally my borders. What are all these people in Jabez's day and age? They're farmers. They're herders. Everything is agrarian. Everybody is, has a farm or works on a farm. That's the agriculture is. By the way, he wanted all of us to be farmers. You know what he says happens when everybody moves into big cities? Bad things. Bad things happen when everybody moves to the big city. Is that true? Yeah. I think that New York City probably has a higher crime rate than Whitwell. I'm just taking a shot at it, but I think that it'd probably be a little bit more dangerous to walk down the streets of some places in Chicago than it would be at South Pittsburgh. That's one of the things I can say. As long as I've lived here, I never felt threatened to walking down the street 10, 11 o'clock at night, back when I would try to do a little walking and running more and stuff. I don't think that I'd be safe in a lot of other places, and I think it'd probably be discouraged. Enlarge my coast. In other words, give me more. A farmer, a herdsman, help me out here. Well, when we think about, this in a physical sense, he's asking for physical blessings. But think about the spiritual blessings. When God said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, folks, we need a means to do that. Do we think about God blessing us as we try to do that? Do we ask God to help us out, Show us some success from the works that we do here. Let folks pay attention to the radio programs, read the articles in the paper and the ads that we run, to take advantage of the Bible studies that we offer. We need to pray about those things, and a lot of times if you're praying about those things, it's going to be on your mind, so that when you're talking to someone, you can say, hey, we've got a correspondence course. Would you like to take that? You don't even have to know anything other than, hey, would you like to take a correspondence course? You let me know, give me the address. We've got them sitting in there, just waiting to be mailed out, hoping that people will respond. Let's pray about that. The tracts that we have, brother, if you don't take them, I can't put the new ones out. Let's take those things and leave them at the grocery store. Leave them when you go to the doctor's office. How many of us go to the doctor's office multiple times a month? Try to leave one. They're interesting in everything, and nowadays they have all the pictures and stuff along with them. Enlarge my coast. Brethren, we need to pray to God to enlarge our coast. And notice, and that thy hand might be with me. God to strengthen us. The hand of God who created all things by simply saying it, creating all this. Wouldn't it be great if God would be with us? Why don't we ask him to be? God, that you would be with me, that thy hand might be with me in the endeavors that I make, and that thou wouldest keep me from evil. Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 6. Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 6, verse 13. This is the Lord teaching his disciples to pray. Verse 9 is one of the reasons that I address my prayers as I normally do. I try not to make it mundane or empty. But when Jesus says, after this manner pray, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, I think that's a pretty good way to start one out, And to think about what you're saying. Just don't say it because Jesus said it, but don't think about the words. But hallowed be thy name. Your name is holy. God is in heaven. Notice verse 13, though. That's the thrust of what we're trying. Lead us not into temptation. I have been at congregations where I've had people, I've listened to a man pray and say, Lord, tempt us. Try us, because, his whole thing was, if you don't work your muscles, they don't get any stronger. And so he was saying what we need to do is work harder and work stronger, and go through these trials and these temptations so we'll be, fit to. And I'm like, those trials and temptations are going to come. Jesus said, don't worry about tomorrow. Why? The end of this chapter. Because today has got more than enough trouble for itself. Don't worry about tomorrow. Today has enough evil, enough things happening to keep you completely busy. But notice what Jesus says. He's teaching the apostles, the disciples, to pray and lead us not into temptation. What is a temptation? What's another word we can stick there? Starts with a T. Next letter's an R. What's that? Trials, yes. What does he say? Lead us not into trials, but deliver us. He's not talking about deliver us from the wicked one, although that would be applicable. Remember, a lot of times in Scripture, particularly the Old Testament, when you see the word evil, it's not talking about satanic or sin. It's talking about bad things. Just bad things in life, like, car trouble and car wrecks and illnesses, things of that nature. That's what he's speaking of here. Jesus says, lead us not into temptation. I was a visitor, so I didn't go up, but I would like to, maybe encourage that young man to think about praying like the Lord prays, because I know you're young. I think when you're 60, you'll be praying that prayer different. You'll be like, boy, Lord, I appreciate all them trials. You've really you built me up, but hey, how about a break? Lead me not into temptation. Yeah. All right. And then notice why. That it may not grieve me. Brethren, that's one of the reasons that Paul says we need to pray for our country. It's hard to preach the gospel to people and sit down and have a Bible study, when snipers are shooting at you. Our tanks are rolling through the street, blowing holes into buildings. That is not an environment to try to convert people to the cause of Christ. Evil, bad things, they grieve us. And when you're going through terrible times in your life, things are hard on you, the last thing you're going to be thinking about is probably trying to win somebody to Christ. When you're going through those things, it's just, the more trouble-free that our lives can be, the more trouble-free that our government keeps our lives. I mean, one of the things you got to appreciate about living in America is the overall security that we have. What was one of the big problems in Rome in the first century? Do you remember? Big problem in Rome. Well, yeah, but I mean just one of those life things. Remember what it was? Remember what they had problems with? Sometimes it'd wipe out half the city. Fire. Oh, we got the fire chief here tonight, huh? We've got things about that now. There is a actual big high-pressure water thing sitting out in our front lot there that you can go through a big water hose on, and you can help fight fires. I mean, that's a great thing. We live in a nation where we have overall security. We have police forces driving the streets at night trying to keep us safe. We have it really made. We should be so thankful for that. They didn't have that in the first century. Rome burnt down. And when it did, remember, Nero blamed it on the Christians. There's a good chance he probably set those fires. But that it may not grieve me. You are not going to be able to function and do the things that you need to do when you're worried about being shot at or things of that nature. Look at this overall prayer. Calling on the God of heaven, asking that, that thou wouldest bless me indeed. Bless me, but not just bless me, but really bless me, if you will. Bless me indeed. Make my coast larger. In other words, my area of influence. I mean, you can take this into the spiritual realm just as easy. That the influence that I have, it be greater than it is now. That I can influence people for the cause of Christ. Not to bring glory or honor to myself, but to let my light so shine that God of heaven may be glorified. That God, your hand would be with me, that you would deliver me, keep me from evil, that I may not be grieved by it. Folks, that's a beautiful prayer. And if you don't get anything out of this lesson tonight, then please take this, and that is that you're not being selfish when you ask God to do good things for you, if in turn you are going to do good things with those things that you have. Yeah, just to build barns and bigger barns and lay them up and say, hey, look how great I've done. Tonight I'll eat, drink, and be merry. What did God say? Thou fool. Tonight you're going to die, and then who's that stuff going to be? But for the average Christian who's trying to live his life right and take care of his family and, raise his kids and help raise his grandkids, and that's a good thing. And we need to pray those things. And don't think you're being selfish because you're asking God to give you a hand. That's what it's all about. Remember that? The idea of mundane things. That's where we spend our life. our lives, for the most part, are just common, everyday, get up and do the things that we do. And that's where we need God in our lives helping us. Increase our borders, keeping evil from us, that it not grieve us. If you're here tonight, you're not a New Testament Christian, hey, you need to fix that. You need to obey the gospel so that you can have the ability to pray like Jabez did. God blessed him, but God is not going to bless you if you know to do that which is right, yet you're not. You're just absolute rebellion. You not say, well, I'm not in rebellion. I'm just not doing it. Folks, that's the same thing. You can't stand on the fence post. You've got to, Jesus said, you're either with me or you're against me. Let me encourage you to be with the Lion of Judah and the Lamb of God. If we can help you in any way,